Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Charity Rouse. I'm the Director of Local History for the Spartanburg County Public Library System. Uh, my colleague Cheryl is on the Landrum Library's Zoom account, and she will be taking all the questions. You can send them to me as well, but I will not see them until the end of the program. And Cheryl will see questions throughout and can help with technical troubleshooting if necessary. There is a handout tonight, and I think Cheryl's going to recopy that in the chat here in a second so that everybody can see that handout. This is the long-awaited compiled handout for all three parts of the Microlocal Resources program that we've been exploring since January. And next month in April, we will be talking about the 1950 census release and how to start finding your people on that document, how it's being released and what's available and all of that good stuff. It's an exciting time, 72 years after the census is taken, it can be released for public access. So, again, everybody will be muted, so use the chat button. If you go to your Zoom controls, usually at either the top or the bottom of your screen, that's the little thought bubble icon chat, and you can type your chat in there. And again, send it to Landrum Library, where my colleague Cheryl will be monitoring things. If you send it to me, I will eventually get it. We will take questions at the end of the program. So let's jump in. So just a quick review about what I mean by microlocal resources. They are produced in a particular location for use in that location. They are often only found in that geographical area. And sometimes they've made it up to a local or a state archive. And then they are really of targeted interest for those in a small geographical area. This is not the US federal census that we'll talk about next month. This is stuff that is local to a place. And these things that we've been looking at over this series are not high on a list of items to digitize, although some of what we have seen are digitized. And in fact, a significant portion of today's resources are print only. So highlighting some things from our library's archival collections. Often there's only a small time frame available that you might get teacher lists from 1868 to 1870, or something from a handful of years or a decade. But you know what? If it's the right handful of years, right decade, and right resource for what you're looking for, that can help you put your people in a time and place, which is part of what we do in genealogy. So let's review some of the records. We covered county or city clerk records in the first session. So those are things like municipal court records, special or called court minutes, county or city council meeting minutes, and then birth, marriage, or death records that may fall outside of mandated state reporting. Tonight, we're going to look at these local businesses or organizations. Funeral homes, store and hotel ledgers, church records, club and community boards records, and newspapers. Last month, we looked at educational records, including those that focus on faculty and staff, as well as those for students. So these are things like school surveys, Board of Education reports, faculty and staff directories for local and state levels, teacher association records, and yearbooks, school newspapers, classroom attendance reports, report cards, and promotion certificates. Now, I haven't had examples of all of these records, but these are the types of things to look for. And this is not an exhaustive list. So these are just examples of the types of records you can find when you get down to the local level and start asking about specific resources that might be held in a given place and time. One last resource from last month's, this just didn't get scanned last month. This is self-titled by someone, and we're not quite sure who. History of Paclitt Mills Elementary School, 1902 to 1916. This is in our archival holdings. No, the tape that was used to repair this, while it's book repair tape, it is not archivally recommended, just FYI. And it's really not a history of Paclitt Mills Elementary School. It's a ledger of the roll. So you see top left there, roll of Paclitt Mills School, beginning September 1st, 1904. The book itself starts in 1902. Which would be the page 56 on the right-hand side is the beginning of the 1902 part. And it lists who's the principal, who's teaching in what grades, and then it's a list of students. And you'll notice on the left-hand column in the left-hand side on pages 84 and 85, that it lists September 1st, 5th, 6th, 19th October. So just as a reminder that students didn't always attend school for an entire school year. They might only come in for a few weeks or a month, or scattered weeks around when they were working in the field with their family for farms, or around when they were needed to earn income in the mill in Paclitt Mills, or if they were young enough that they were not working in the mill, although that by about age 12, children were working in the mill and sometimes younger. And so this was also a time period in mill history where a lot of the mill workers still retained a farm or worked for family periodically, and then would come to the mill for a few months at a time around the farm schedule. So, you know, kids were moving in and out. There was also not a mandate for children to be in school for a particular amount of time. So you may see some of these students re-enroll every couple of months with the assumption that they went somewhere else and came back. So, but that's one last school resource. If you missed part 2 that focused on educational resources, that video is up on the library YouTube page. So, oh, there's my example of closer up on the, this is September 4th, 1905 school year. F.B. Woodruff was the principal and teacher for 7th through 9th grades. This was a 5-room schoolhouse, but it covered grades K through 9. So Miss Woodruff, Miss Vincent, Mrs. Poole, and Miss Calhoun were other teachers. So let's look at some community and business records. This is the Glen Springs Hotel Register. Yeah, I can type. Sorry about that. Started in 1897. The facing page does have ads, but those did not get scanned. because for this particular program, that's not important. But if you were researching businesses that were working in the Glen Springs area at the time, you might want to look at the ads. This is held in this Spartanburg County Public Library archival collection. And you see that the clerk or manager or whoever was writing the dates really liked to be fancy. So on Tuesday, June 16th, one person checked in, and they were from Spartanburg, and it looks like a whole bunch of initials. Wednesday, June 17th, we have people from Allendale, South Carolina, from Columbia, South Carolina, and it looks like some of them just say "and wife." So it gives you some information about who was coming to the Glen Springs Hotel. And if these were your ancestors, this gives you an idea of relative wealth, because they could spend the money to travel to the hotel. The Glen Springs were a healing springs, so the water was reputed to be good for you and to heal all sorts of ailments. So they may have been coming for that, or they just may have been escaping the low country in the summer when it gets really humid and hot down there. Not that we don't get humid and hot up here, but not quite to the same extent. But it's kind of fun. Lots of fun signatures, and overall it looks like each of the guests was writing their own registration, which is why the day, each date is fancier, because that divides up the days. The next record that we have in our archival collection is a ledger from the Og W. Smith department store on Main Street in Spartanburg. This particular page is from 1926. And you'll see in January 18th, 1926, that top left, that these are the people who owed balances from, $1.50 for Mrs. L.E. Boyd to Miss, that may be Jeannie Thompson, who owes $189.32. So this is a really fun ledger to look at. It looks like there are two primary clerks given the handwriting. You see the fancier handwriting, and you see a little bit more straightforward handwriting. And this was what they were billing on the accounts. So it does have some limitations. Time period is one. It only lists those who have accounts, but it can be a way to find the women in the family, because it says Mrs. M. Jennings or Miss Olivia, whatever her name was, or Wood, or whatever the surname is. And so it does help place some of our harder to find ancestors, such as women, in a location at a given time. It also tells us a little bit about spending habits. Now, they could have been putting together a trousseau to be married or something of that nature, or they could have been clothing an entire family. This was a department store, so they had all sorts of goods. And before the advent of credit cards, you could often run a monthly tab at the store itself, and even beyond credit cards. But this is a good way to find local merchant records. Now, does every merchant record survive? No. This is a somewhat isolated account book that we have, but it can be very helpful. We do have some loose receipts for a grocery store, general store at one of the county crossroads, and some things like that. So we have some representative examples. And again, if this is your ancestor in that time and place, you might just pull that needle out of the haystack. And just as a reminder, we do see women's names in this ledger. They could not actually get a credit card in their own name in many places without a man co-signing, read husband or father, until the 1974 Equal Credit Act. Less than 50 years ago, women could not, in general, get a credit card in their own name. So these lists from the 1920s that name our female ancestors can be critical to helping us find them. So another type of business records that we have are some early records of the Floyd mortuary. In some of my other genealogy programs, I will remind people to, hey, if you can't find an obituary, if you can't find a death certificate, contact the funeral home. In this case, we have duplicates of the records that survive from that era, to the best of our knowledge. These were actually filmed by Family Search in 1996. They are on microfiche, which is a flat type of film. They cover funerals and accounts from roughly 1901 to 1934. And the information provided varies, even though it's a kind of standard form. Not all the forms and fields got filled in a way that you would think. Now, it does include both African American or colored and white records that are filed separately, except for during World War I. So apparently during World War I, there was a shortage of help, and they took the easiest way and filed everybody's funeral record together and did not worry about dividing it out by African American or white records. So I've got examples from each period. So this is someone who is in the white files in 1912. And so you see the name of the deceased, Edith Easler from Cherokee. The person paying the bill was L.B. Easler of Spartanburg Route 1. So I'm assuming that was Cherokee Springs Post Office, because it wouldn't have been Cherokee County, or it could have been Cherokee County, but not if the post office was Cherokee. Anyway, date of death was December 5th, 1912, and she died at home. Date of the funeral was December 6th, and the date of burial was also on December 6th. Funeral services at church. We always wish they would tell us which church, but hey, it's a lead. It wasn't at the house. You might know, if you've been researching the family, what church it was likely to be, and the church might have some additional records. The place of burial was Mount Pleasant. Time of funeral services, 1 p.m., race, white. Age, 27 years. And then it tells you what casket they bought. I don't know what casket number 56 is, but you might be able to research that. If you keep looking down, they've got one petticoat for $1.39, one pair of pants, 50 cents, one corset cover, 50 cents, one gauge vest. $2.60 for presumably clothing to be buried in. That is not what those fields were intended to be: name of mother, name of husband, name of wife, body to be shipped to. So again, just know sometimes you don't get all of the information you want, but you do get some interesting information, and it is a confirmation that the person died, and hopefully gives you enough information to know whether it's the person you're looking for or not. And the bottom on the flowers line, it does say flowers from Moss. So my assumption is in 1912, there was a floral shop by that name. So as I said, in 1917 to 1921, during World War I, the records were not separated by race. And you see here a record for James Radford on the left. And he was colored, and presumably he was at Camp Wadsworth. Flu epidemic was in its second year or so, third year, however long it lasted, in 17, 18, 19, 20, because the funeral expenses were being charged to the US government. They were shipping the body to, looks like Coolwell or Colwell, Virginia. Not quite sure where that is, so I'd have to look. Although it's interesting, it says he was 84 years old, so I don't know. But it gives us information that he died in the hospital here on July 27th of 19. On the right-hand side, you have Robert Reed. And again, they're charging this to the US government. I have a feeling the US government didn't really want everybody categorized in separate roles, but I don't know. They were still separate in the military, so it was probably just expedience on the part of the clerk. And then it tells the files, and his body is being shipped to somewhere in Ohio. So, and this one does say 27 years. Now, I could be misreading that 84 years. It could be 24 years, 21 years, who knows? The handwriting is not the greatest. And then a later period record for an African American in 1927 is Mr. Henry Lucas, and he died in the county home. And the order, the county was paying for the funeral, and he was 83 years old. The physician was J.E. Cudd, and there were some basic charges there. So, but those can be fascinating. Community records for institutions also exist. And again, this is just a small sampling of what we have in our archival collections and what is out there at the state archive level, at other institutions, and in other archives around. So, you know, it never hurts to Google search and check archival catalogs. This is Kennedy Library. I love these book plates. Helen Kennedy, Mrs. L.C. Kennedy, donated this particular book. It is a reused book. You note the pages have been cut out from whatever the previous purpose was, and the book plate was glued over whatever Lionel had written in here. And that is Lionel Chalmers Kennedy's signature, for whom the Kennedy Library was named. And so it's kind of cool book. but this is the initial book of visitors to the Kennedy Free Library. Kennedy Library, it may not have been the Free Library yet at that point. We changed our name a couple of times. And this is in the 1880s. I would assume 1886, February. But you see Mrs. W.P. Irwin, James Finches, C.W. Evans, somebody with really elaborate handwriting, J.L. Fleming, and then February 15th, you see more. And so these people are signing in as they enter and visit the library to look for books to check out. During this time period, we were a subscription library where you paid, I believe it was $3 to be a member of it for a year, and that allowed you borrowing privileges. I believe other people could go into the library and read, but they just couldn't check things out. Books were very expensive. Paper was expensive. And so it is something interesting to see. You do see there's Annie Reed is visiting from New York, and then E.C. Wofford is in from Walnut Grove. So not just people in downtown Spartanburg using the resources. Now, Miss Reed could be a student at Converse. I think Converse had started by then. So, or traveling through, or summering somewhere, wintering somewhere warmer than New York. So this is just another page. Lee Linder, Mrs. Lee Linder was coming in from Gaffney. Dr. Carlisle was a local physician. So there are a lot of really good names. But if you had ancestors living in Spartanburg at the time, it would be interesting to read through this book to see if they were library members and used the library. So, another type of community record are church records, and this is just one example. The Buck Creek Baptist Church, and Baptist churches, of course, don't have a lot of, might have baptismal records, but they're not going to be infant baptism, because Baptist churches, you join as an adult or someone who can make their own decision, not as an infant. This book is in the library's archival collection, and it has also been microfilmed by this just lost the name of the collection, but the Baptist history collection at Furman. And but the church decided it needed to be in a safer place than a random church member's attic. And so it has been placed with us for safekeeping. It is extremely fragile. And you see incomplete pages here at the front for 1876. I believe that is the date. You will find lists of members and transferred in, entered into the roll at a certain time, transferred out, and just these will appear periodically through the minutes, because the membership is able to, the clerk is able to see the list in one place rather than having to go through meeting by meeting, business meeting by business meeting. So they list additions and deletions from the rolls, but other places in the meeting, it's just the minutes of the meeting. Sometimes you may find the scandals of the day. Not saying there's scandals on this particular page, but I have seen where, and I'm not even sure it was this church, it was one of the local Baptist churches, where a male Sunday school teacher who was married and had kids was brought up for fathering a child on a young lady in the church. So, you find all sorts of tidbits. And in the earlier centuries, churches did kick people out of fellowship a lot more often than they do today. But you do get some information about the sermon, who presented it, and those types of things, which can be some interesting reading. Now, I have to say, depending on the clerk, you may get more or less detail. Handwriting quality varies widely. One of my biggest pet peeves was when I was researching for a historical service for the 100th anniversary of a church. All it said was, and hymns were sung. It didn't tell us what hymns, even by name of text, not tune necessarily. And so it was very frustrating because I was trying to be historically accurate to what scriptures were read, what hymns were sung, and we couldn't be. We just had to guess. So, but these church records can be invaluable. Now, church records may be at a local library like this. They may be at the denominational archive. Here in Spartanburg, we have the United Methodist Archive for South Carolina at Wofford, and then the Baptist Archive is at Furman. So it's just one of those things where sometimes you have to dig a little bit. And then there are also churches who have retained the only copies of their materials, and goodness help us if there's a fire. So, like anything else, a scan or photocopying of the records at some point, microfilming of the records. Our new Book Eye scanner is really good at scanning books so quickly and without a lot of stress on the book itself. So hopefully we can capture more of these valuable records. Yes, and then when possible, prior to 1865, do check at the back of the book, because if enslaved people were members of the church, some clerks would list them as colored in the main membership listing. Other clerks would list them separately, usually in the back of the volume. When you're looking at microfilmed volumes, it can be hard to figure out where the back of that volume is compared to the next volume, but at least take a look for that, because it can be really helpful. After 1865, you do begin to see separate African American churches as they are able to worship without supervision of a white person. And that's its own story and whole different program. So, community groups, I've got a couple garden club examples, but again, we have records for local Red Cross chapter. We have records for the Hubbub nonprofit, for a couple of different historic preservation groups, mostly ones that are no longer in existence because they've merged, and we have the archival record for those organizations. But there are plenty of community groups, and we just happen to have a number of yearbooks and other records, including board meeting minutes and minutes of general meetings of a number of different types of organizations. These just happen to be garden clubs. So the yearbook of the Gardeners of Spartanburg, South Carolina for 1936 and 37. These yearbooks often include club membership, program listings for the year, contacts for the organizational members. They may also have minutes for the club or their board meetings, although those are usually in separate documents. And these examples, again, are from our SCPL archival collections. So this is one of the pages from this book. So tells you that Mrs. Hayes, Mrs. Wilson, and Mrs. Gwathmey are on the program committee. They did a plant exchange. Mrs. Dodgen and Nicholas are there. I'm not sure what their pilgrimage was, probably a garden tour of some sort. And purchasing had its own subcommittee there. And then there are members and honorary members listed. Apparently, Mrs. J.T. Brown may have died within the year or didn't pay her dues and is crossed off there by whoever's booklet this was. And you see interesting phone numbers that don't resemble current phone numbers, but were valid in the day. And then this is a slightly later example from 1952 and 1953 with a cool cover. And there are more membership committees. It states that they meet the first Friday of the month at 11:30 a.m. They do a flower exhibit at the fair and again do plant exchange. They're doing more publicity. There's membership. So again, and especially for our female ancestors, sometimes these clubs and organizations are a really good way to track them because depending on social class, they might not have had a job outside the home, probably did not if they were middle to upper class in early half of the 20th century. Not always, but often. And these garden clubs and women's clubs and other groups were a way for them to get out of the house, do something, and have leadership. So just something to look into. And they might have even been interested in gardening. Now, I was in a discussion about local gardening clubs just last week, and one of the folks in the conversation said, well, there are some garden clubs in name only, but they just get together to socialize and drink. So, depends on the garden club, I guess. But, I mean, they always were a bit of a social group. But there was also the Men's Garden Club here in Spartanburg that really took on some of the early leadership of the Spots of Pride in the median, although I was told that a couple other ladies came up with the idea. So again, you'll see the little signs in the median strip with that. And we have some of the Men's Garden Club records as well. So newspapers is another place to really look at what was going on with your ancestors. So definitely check the society pages because I have found, oh, so-and-so is visiting, or so-and-so is leaving to visit their aunt in some other location. And so you can sometimes find where other family members have moved by where someone is visiting. Religious denominational newspapers can be extremely helpful, depending on how devout and how active your ancestor was or family member. This on the left happens to be the Southern Christian Advocate, which is the newspaper of the Methodist Church in South Carolina. It may cover slightly more than just South Carolina. And you get obituaries, you get marriages, sometimes you get births. but mostly marriages and obituaries. The saddest page that I looked up and read was actually the first marriage of Frank Watkins, who's in the top left of this page. His first wife, they married, and a week later she got some infection and died. And so in the same edition of the Southern Christian Advocate was both their marriage announcement and her obituary. And so that's just how life was. This one is a little bit later period, and Frank's second wife was one of my great-grandmother's sisters. Now, sometimes in the church obituaries, you don't get a lot of hard facts. You get a lot of, they were a wonderful, kind Christian person. But hey, it's an obituary, sometimes in a time period where you don't have other newspapers that survive. Actually, in the Southern Christian Advocate, I have obituaries for my fourth great-grandparents. So it's kind of cool, but it's a good place to look. There are many, many newspapers online and various free and paid databases. There is a pretty significant list in the handout, so we're not going to go through all of them. And something to remember is that even more newspapers are not available online. So do check with the local library, historical society, genealogy society, to see what they recommend and where to look for that particular area and time period where you are searching. In Kansas, that state historical society was literally started by the newspaper publishers in the brand new state of Kansas. In the 1860s, it may have been 1870 couple. So they have the largest collection of Kansas published newspapers, period. Multiple languages, etc. So if you cannot find the newspaper on the local level, go to the state archives, State Historical Society in Kansas. It's in Topeka. They'll do a limited amount of reference for distance people, but you may just still have to go there. They are getting grants every year to digitize more and more and more of that newspaper collection, but it's hundreds of thousands of rolls of microfilm. So it's just an immense collection. So you may have to put some boots on the ground and go, but you may also be lucky to find it digitized in a given place. So I'm going to talk about these. Links to them are in the handout, but there are free resources for newspapers. Chronicling America, and Chronicling America is strongest prior to 1923, although they do continue to add more recent. Our copyright restriction, copyright-free materials stalled out in 1923 for quite a few years. Thank you, Disney. And now things are rolling into public domain each year since then. I think we're up to 1928, something like that now. Elephant is a global resource. They are adding things every day, working with Chronicling America and the Library of Congress, working with Australian archives, working with some of the archives in Europe, primarily English speaking, but that is changing. And so It's a huge database, and you may find what you need, especially internationally, but you may not. Check coverage because they'll tell you what they cover. Google Newspaper Archive is getting clunkier by the day. And so it's one of those things that it can be helpful. One of the things we do find is that sometimes it is sometimes you find that they did not divide it by day. When they were scanning from the microfilm, you'll see one day has 250 pages. Likely that's more than one day, and it just didn't get divided out correctly. So do check on the Google Newspaper Archive. What of the Spartanburg Herald Journal they have is under Herald Journal, Herald-Journal. Spartanburg is nowhere in the title. So go to the H's, click on Herald Journal, and you'll get to the Spartanburg one. And Cheryl, if you can put the handout link in the chat again, please. Thank you. FultonHistory.com has come out of an old site. It's a personally run site. I haven't heard of it being purchased by any of the big guys yet. And it was Fulton postcards, I believe, originally, and started adding a lot of newspapers. The search on that is exceedingly clunky and breaks down pretty regularly because it's just not scaled for the amount of stuff that's on there, nor the number of searchers. But it's a great resource and particularly strong. It's out of Fulton County, New York. And so it's extremely strong in New York and that region, but he scans whatever newspapers he can get his hands on. There are databases through your local or state libraries. On the handout, there's a guide for getting to South Carolina newspaper database, historical newspapers database through the state library. If you are a resident of South Carolina, you can apply to get a library card with the state library, and it gives access to their databases. Our library is working to, in July, with our new budget year, get a America's Newspapers database and Heritage Hub, which is the new version of America's Obituaries and Death Notices from Newsbank. Stay tuned for more information about those two databases because those are going to be wonderful for our patrons. Just saying. Also, microfilm at local or state level libraries or archives. You may have to pay for printing. They may do a lookup for you, obituary or news article lookup for you for free. There may be a small charge. In the past, we have charged $10 or $5 an obituary to look them up. So it just depends on the library and what their fees are. We're in the midst of revising our fee schedule post-pandemic. So again, call us and ask, email us and ask, and we'll let you know if there is a charge. Now, they're paid resources, things that you can, these are things that an individual can subscribe to. Things like Newsbank do not have individual subscriptions. Local paper, such as it is, and online access to the local paper with their e-edition. Newspapers.com. Ancestry has purchased this. There are a couple levels of that. There's a newspapers.com one, and then there's the Publisher's Extra. And I hear grumbling about the Publisher's Extra piece of it, but the newspaper publisher has the right to say, nope, you've got to charge this. You've got to charge an extra amount for access to our newspaper. And the question is, do you want access or do you not want access? There is a fee for that. Some library systems do have a library edition of newspapers.com. We do not. These newspaper databases, if you think they're expensive for an individual, they're a little bit of a sticker shock for an institution. Just saying. Genealogybank.com is another good one. I have friends in the genealogy world who love Genealogy Bank, but it does depend on where you're looking. The places that I need to get newspapers from are not available through Genealogy Bank, or were not the last time I checked. So their contracts with the newspapers do change over time. They do add newspapers. One thing to check when you look at what newspapers are available, do check the dates, because sometimes they'll say, oh, we have the Carolina Spartan, and it turns out they have 3 issues, not anywhere close to a complete run. So it's just one of those things, check before you buy, buyer beware. Accessible Archives does have a individual subscription. It's also available for libraries. We no longer have it because no one was using it. But it does have access to a lot of African-American newspapers around the country. And just because you are looking for a news article in one place, it doesn't mean it might not have been picked up by a newspaper in another place. Specifically, an example from Accessible Archives a number of years ago when I was looking at it, there was a church, and I don't even remember what denomination now, that the headquarters of the church was, I believe, in Detroit. And so they were reporting on what the church in Spartanburg was doing, but it was published in the Detroit newspaper, African-American newspaper. So sometimes you got to look. Often local papers specialed things up to the state paper in South Carolina. Not all states have a state paper in the same way that South Carolina does, but it's kind of handy when they do. So, for instance, Kansas does not, just saying. But you may find things have been picked up by another paper in a different location. Obituaries might be published where one of the children lives or a parent lives, that kind of thing. Ancestry.com, findmypast.com, and myheritage.com are the 3 of the large genealogy databases. Ancestry does have some things that are newspaper and obituary related that are not cross-posted from newspapers.com. And so it's always worth a check to see if you can find what you're looking for at one of those. And that is tonight's session. And I am going to see if I can switch over to the handout on view. And of course, it's not letting me get to the controls. So let me see here. Cheryl, did that switch over to the Microlocal resources handout?
Yes, it did.
Woohoo! Technology for the win for once. So, and the link to this is in your handout or in the chat. If you can't open it for some reason, do just send an email to KROOM@infodepot.org, infodepot.org. So we're the Kennedy room, so KROOM at Infodepot. At one point It was somebody's cute idea for the fact that we were an information depot, like a railroad depot, and Spartanburg was at one point known as the hub city because we had so many railroads coming in and out of Spartanburg. So, but as I said, these are not exhaustive, but they're good ideas for places to look. We will be looking at the 1950 census next month. And then in May, we'll be looking at some federal records for localities like Spartanburg, which I think is going to be a fun program if I can get it all pulled together. So, are there questions?
No questions so far.
Okay, I should have asked for questions before I went over to the handout, but I was trying real hard to get to the handout. And I'm just kind of scrolling through this so that it gets recorded. And I thought I got all the pages headers with the stuff, but oh well. I thank you for taking this little plunge through our micro-local resources. It's a lot of fun. It's getting into the weeds. It's the original sub-series title was getting into the genealogical weeds, and I got told that that was too long. So micro-local resources, the hyper-local resources. And so these things are, you know, when you've exhausted all the big guys, if you've looked for birth, marriage, death, if you've looked for, you know, vital records, if you've looked for the census, if you've done all the big collections, then you're going to want to look at these smaller records. And again, if it is your ancestor that you find, that's that needle in the haystack that you love to do. So, if there are no questions in the chat, I do thank you for your attention tonight, and look forward to seeing you next month, first Monday of April. And that'll be, I believe, the 4th and just after the census release on the 1st. So I hope I'll have some good examples and that we don't crash the National Archives website again as we did 10 years ago when the 1940 census released. So it should be fun. So thank you so much and see you next time. Check us out on our YouTube channel. Do subscribe to the YouTube channel to get updates for when we post new content. We have a genealogy playlist, and that's where all of these sessions have been posted, including one that's much more robust about all of these newspaper resources. Thank you so much.